Hello, everyone. My name is Isha Nelson, and I'm a business and economics reporter for the New York Times. I'm based in London. Thank you all for joining us today for our On Record program. I know the Chicago Council would also like to say a special thank you to their members for joining us. As a reminder, the Council is a non-profit, independent and non-partisan platform. Mine and Professor Mazzucato's views do not represent the Council. I can also say that I do not speak on behalf of the New York Times either. I'm really excited to introduce you to today's guest. Mariana Mazzucato is a professor of economics of innovation and public value at University College London. She is also the founder and director of UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So today we're going to be discussing her new book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, which you can buy now. I think if you're in Chicago, the council has a partnership with the bookseller. You can get your copies there or anywhere else. A good opportunity to say support your local bookstores. I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end, maybe 15, 20 minutes. So please send us your questions. You can do that on the website ccga.live. You just go on there and you can pop your email address in and ask your questions. You can also vote on questions that you really like to make sure I definitely see them. So please do that. And I think we'll get started right away. So Professor Mazzucato, the world is facing multiple crises. We've got climate change, we have the pandemic, we have inequality, and your book really talks about a way to build solutions to some of these really, really big problems. And it hinges on this idea of rethinking capitalism, rethinking the role of government to build a more inclusive economy. So I want you to just start us off by explaining what it means to think in a mission-oriented way.
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much for agreeing to be the moderator here, because you and I had a wonderful interview together on my previous book, so it's an honor. So the first point that I raise in the book, and also when I talk to governments around a mission-oriented approach, is that it really requires kind of going back to first principles. What is the state? What is policy for? And here we need to kind of move away from the standard mainstream view, at least within economics, of the answer to that, which is the state is there to fix market failures. You actually have to wait for the market to mess up in order to actually do anything, whether it's because of pollution, which comes about because of a particular market failure around negative externalities. The state might come in with a carbon tax, or the opposite, when you have good things like basic research and all the knowledge spillovers, that's seen as a public good that comes from another type of market failure, which is when you have positive externalities. So it's not that those market failures don't exist. The problem is, if we do have problems in our economy, which you've just mentioned, we seem to be going from one crisis to another, and you're just constantly in the bandaging up mode, the market fixing mode, you're simply not going to change the kind of system you have. So the first point of the answer, I guess, is that a moonshot approach is really about co-creating and co-shaping markets, not fixing them. And that actually means having very different types of tools. So for example, lots of government policies might translate into lists, for example, of different sectors that might need to be supported. You might look today, for example, at the Endless Frontier Act that the Biden administration is supporting. It's actually coming from Chuck Schumer's team. Or in the UK, we had an industrial strategy that had a list of different sectors that the government thought were really important. It was automotive, aerospace, life sciences, and so on. And a mission-oriented approach says, hold on a second, don't just make a random list of sectors or technologies or types of companies like small, medium enterprises. Think about what your problems are, whether it's climate change, the digital divide, weak health systems. Focus on that and then work backwards and get all your different sectors to innovate and to invest in order to meet that goal. And that doesn't happen just by talking about it in places like Davos, right? You actually need to redesign the instruments, the procurement policy, the grants, the loans, the industrial strategy, in order really to galvanize that bottom-up experimentation across lots of different sectors. And I start the book with the example of the Apollo program and why that's
Tell us why that works in terms of thinking first about the problem that you're trying to solve and then working backwards. The examples of how you, rather than starting with we have all these departments, what can we do?
Yep, great. So first of all, more than half the book actually says, and the Apollo program is not a good example of what I'm talking about today, right? Because the wicked problems, climate change, but also lots of the social problems around inequality, the digital divide itself is a social problem in terms of who has access to the opportunities that the 21st century, in theory, gives us. But first, let's just focus a minute on the Apollo program, because it was so interesting how, first of all, it was addressing a challenge, right? The Apollo program was addressing this Cold War challenge, Sputnik, beat the Russians. Had they simply left it at that, they wouldn't have done much, right? So if you think of the Sustainable Development Goals today, really, really important goals. These are the challenges. But if you just leave it at like no hunger, reduce inequality, fight climate change, it doesn't actually give you a pathway. So what the Apollo program did in terms of, just think back at Kennedy's speech in 1962, it was very clear what the target then was: getting to the moon and back again in one generation. And having such a bold, inspirational goal, first of all, but that really, first of all, that you can answer the question, did you do it or not? Did you beat the Russians? Did you do the space race? That's, too broad. Did you get to the moon and back in one generation? You can answer that. But what was interesting was lots of different sectors had to contribute to that. They would have never gotten there had it just be framed as an aeronautics problem. There was huge amounts of investment in areas like nutrition, textiles, electronics, the entire software industry. In some ways, the modern day software industry was a spillover from that. And also lots of experimentation, lots of projects, lots of homework problems had to be done, of which many failed. The whole Apollo 1 disaster was, a massive failure, but they didn't let that, stop them. And today, anytime there's a failure within government, front page of the newspaper in the UK where you and I live, on the Daily Mail, blaming civil servants as soon as they make a mistake. That kind of willingness to take risks, that speech that, that Kennedy gave very explicitly said, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy. We will mess up along the way, but, it's kind of worth it. So the question is, do we actually talk like that today? Do we say, we're going to fight climate change because it's hard, not because it's easy? Yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to be worth it. Why is it worth it? Because, it's urgent. It's indeed very much even a security risk if you think about it in terms of how we frame sometimes these more wartime missions. But what's so interesting today, I think, when we look at the societal missions that are underneath the SDGs, if you just frame them as a wartime mission, that's not going to galvanize the kind of excitement that we need in order really to bring lots of different actors, public, private, different sectors together to accomplish these missions. But one of the interesting things for me was also how seriously the NASA took the problem in terms of really thinking how they were going to work with business. This was not, this was state-led, but it wasn't, just the state. There was, as I just mentioned, lots of different sectors, but that also meant lots of different businesses from, Honeywell, General Electric, Motorola, and so on. And NASA paid a lot of attention on how to partner with these businesses in such a way that really would create what I would call today a symbiotic partnership, right? So they even had things like no excess profits clauses in the procurement contracts. And they worried about things like how do you actually make sure that we contain costs? So they began with these cost plus contracts, which they believed eventually that were too easily gamed in terms of costs being inflated. And they moved over to fixed price contracts with incentives for continual innovation. And they also worried about things like how can we within NASA make sure that we're capable and knowledgeable and not going to be easily then captured by what they called brochuremanship. Today's PowerPoints when PwC or a consulting company comes in and acts, and shows the shiny PowerPoints. At the time they had brochures, and they were interested in the fact that if they weren't investing within their own knowledge creating kind of mechanisms within the state, they would, not even know how to write the terms of reference with business, which I think.
And I'm going to pause you here because we had a little trouble getting started, it seems. And so I want to make sure people know that if they have questions for you, that they can go to ccga.live and put their questions in, and that we know that the name of your book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide, Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. They can get that now. It's available in the US. And that I just wanted to say, the thing about talking about this mission-oriented approach, it almost makes going to the moon sound easy, the way you did in a book. It suddenly becomes this very clear problem, get to the moon and back within a decade. And obviously there are a million one things that need to be done to get there, but the framing of it makes it seem easy. And so today's problems, as we discussed, the pandemic, health inequality, economic inequality, climate change are so big, but also often international problems. And so how do you apply this Moonshot approach and the public partnership approach on an international scale when these problems can't be solved by one government alone?
Great point. And one of the missions that I've been working on also with the European Commission in terms of its own international collaborations is the plastic-free ocean mission. And of course, no one country is going to get the plastic out of the ocean by definition because of, water moves. And I mean, I think the answer is, first of all, that anytime we talk about international collaboration, it still requires the different nations to actually have the capacity on the ground. And I actually find that that's one of the biggest problems is it's hard to collaborate in the same way that it's hard for the state to collaborate with business. It's hard for different nations to collaborate on something if they actually don't have the capacity on the ground. And so, one of the things that Gus Grissom said, this was one of the astronauts who died in the Apollo 1 fire. He was saying, like, how are we even going to get to the moon if we can't communicate between these different buildings? Because he couldn't hear what the mission control room was saying to him. And this was just hours before Apollo 1 exploded. And so what NASA then did, and I'll come back to this international question you just asked, was take that moment, as a real kind of like self-reflective moment to say, we have to change our own organization to be much more horizontal, to be more communicative, to nurture communication between our different departments, which are working in silos. And that led, people like George Mueller, who had just come in from Bell Labs, to really think of the massive organizational change that NASA had to undergo if it was going to be purpose and mission oriented with the mission as hard as going to the moon and back. And I think that issue about communication and not working inside of silos is just as true within governments as between. It's hard to collaborate if you're not listening to each other, if you're not learning from each other in terms of even what works, what doesn't. And I'm thinking about this a lot today, actually, with the Biden administration, which after 4 years of what I would call kind of a mercantilistic policy, much less emphasis on science and technology and investment, much more on things like trade and trade agreements from the Trump administration. What can the Biden administration learn globally of kind of what works, what doesn't, when you have these kind of mission-oriented approaches? So, for example, in Sweden, there's a really interesting mission that we've actually, when I say we, I mean my team inside the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose that I direct, University College London. They have this really interesting high-level mission that the government is going for, which is a fossil-free welfare state. And then they land that on everything the state does, from public education, public health, and public transport. And again, landed even more specifically, for example, around in public education, school meals. What would it look like to have a school meal mission to make sure that all meals delivered in Sweden or any country in the US are healthy, tasty, but also sustainable, kind of that carbon neutrality mission, that we often talk about at this very aggregate level, land that down at something as specific as a school meal and roll it out across the country, A, and B, get kids involved. And this comes to, part of the question that you were framing when you have these social missions that aren't just technological, like getting to the moon. Citizen engagement becomes really, really important. And I think that's one of the things governments are weakest on.
Yeah, I want to come to that point around how do you make these last. But before we get to that, how have these ideas and this way of thinking, this mission-oriented approach way of thinking, changed during the pandemic? Because obviously we talked a lot about it before. You do a ton of policy work, right? You work with governments and institutions to do this. How has the past year changed some of the thinking? Because we've seen huge spending programs. We've seen kind of lots of government throw out the rule book in terms of how much they can be engaged and how interventionist they can be. We've seen companies say they want to think more long-term, sustainably. They want to think about their employees and all the rest of it, all this stuff that sounds great. Do you see this really taking hold, or do you worry that actually this could be a lot of short-term ambition, right? There's this big spurt of we're going to do things big and great, but do you see this kind of continuing long-term?
I mean, I see it as more relevant than ever of needing this kind of approach. We still haven't delivered personal protection equipment to frontline workers globally, many frontline workers, which we call essential, but then don't treat them as essential, both in terms of pay or resourcing the institutions that they work in, or also protecting them in terms of the PPE and so on. So that's just a big wake-up call, right? I mean, what does it mean when we don't have even that capacity to transform also existing production to deliver that. Because don't forget that in World War II, we had the whole automobile industry transformed within a very a quick amount of time. Actually, it was about 6 months in the United States to become a wartime kind of machine. That wouldn't have happened, for example, without trade unions that really actually helped to negotiate that transition. And one of the things is, do we have today a nimble, flexible, agile, public, private, but also, again, civil society, in terms of, if we think of the role of trade unions, ability to transform and to create that capacity on the ground when we need it? And I think the answer we've seen globally is no. Having said that, another really interesting lesson is that globally the experience has been so different. In some countries like Vietnam or the state of Kerala and India actually did really well compared to even countries like the UK where you and I live. In the UK, we have ended up outsourcing a lot of government capacity, for example, to consulting companies. This has come out both during Brexit and COVID. And what's interesting in Vietnam and Kerala is they've actually, their success was not independent of the investments they have been making over the last 10 or actually more 20 years within their own public administration. And I think that's a huge lesson from COVID. But also in terms of the concept of missions, how it's recently been applied to the vaccine, I think is interesting, because the vaccine itself is not the mission, right? The mission has to be making sure that everyone globally has access to the vaccine, that it's universally accessible. And that then makes sure that we're governing that process in a mission-oriented way, which would mean things like, the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who I'm actually going to be working with now in a new council that I'm chairing on the economics of health for all, with WHO, they've been arguing that we need to, if we're going to accomplish this mission of universal access to the vaccine, make sure that we're governing patents, intellectual property rights in a fundamentally different way, and have a patent pool. He calls this the people's vaccine tool. And also make sure that we don't have, vaccine apartheid with some countries just hoarding, all the dosages. So this issue that if you have a mission, it's not just like the thing in and of itself, but how you govern those relationships and the production and the innovation in order to accomplish it. And again,
coming up with these missions, how do you work with governments and institutions to make sure that they outlast, I guess, the government that comes up with it, right? It's great to apply these to really big challenges, but these are really long-term challenges. And obviously we are in democracies where people can, of course, change their mind. But if this is going to work, there has to be some consistency. And you brought it up right at the start, but I think the UK's industrial strategy is a good example of work you did to kind of think about challenges and missions. And then we very recently watched that in the middle of this pandemic get quietly pushed away and replaced with something else that doesn't have that same amount of work that went into it. So how do you, and you worked with the Italian government too, which has also just changed. How do we make this stuff kind of outlast the first person who works on it?
It's a very important question. And in fact, that's why originally, kind of 10 years ago, I started to work on a concept which isn't so much mission-oriented policy, but mission-oriented organizations, right? The kind of DARPA, ARPA-E, Corfo in Chile, BNDES in Brazil. So it's not just a US-centric point, but what does it mean to have a mission-oriented organization and government, which is public, but not political, right? So it's independent of the political process. So as you say, as you have a new election and some, new leader comes in, the organization itself actually remains, and it remains with that kind of remit of taking kind of, big bets around purpose, kind of public purpose-driven goals. And I think the reason that DARPA is so interesting is that, on the one hand, it obviously has been part of the kind of, wartime industrial complex. It's an innovation agency within the US Department of Defense. But how it's worked is, it's brought people in on secondment for 5 years. They have a limited time frame. They're actually evaluated by how willing they are to take these kind of, difficult challenges and to be risk-taking around big public goals. Often, in the case of DARPA, wartime related, but there's ARPA-E now within the Department of Energy, similar kind of concept around the kind of the green transition that we need today. And I think, that's again, like really important, because those 5 years aren't necessarily coinciding with the 4-year election cycle, but also the fact that there's so much emphasis on intra-organizational culture of, again, agility, knowing not only when to turn the tap on for a project, but also when to turn it off if it's not working. Those things matter, because otherwise you get what you just mentioned. The risk is it just becomes a pet project of some minister who comes in and says, oh, let's do, X. And if it isn't nested within the actual organizational structure of the state, But also coming back to the earlier point of citizen engagement, if we're talking about things like carbon neutral city missions, which is one type of mission that we've been working on globally, what does it actually mean to get real buy-in on it? So it's not just, the idea of one politician, but that it becomes, that you end up having kind of a consensus within citizens that this is an important thing to do, but also that their own voices are being heard. And I do think, again, that this is one of the hardest things because our civil servants aren't trained to do that. You really need empathy. And by empathy, I don't mean sympathy. I mean that you have to listen and put yourself in other people's shoes if you are going to bring, different actors to the table, not just to react to a mission, but to actually design it itself. So one of the things in the UK that's been interesting on the back of Brexit, where, as you know, there was so much debate, contested debate, citizen assemblies kind of got reinvigorated, right? In terms of places where people kind of fought it out about whether Brexit was good or not. I actually think we really need to, reimagine and reinvigorate citizen assemblies for how we come together as a society and decide what these kind of, public purpose, mission-oriented areas are. Because if you don't do that, it won't last. You'll have, as you say, great idea, but then a new, minister comes in, changes that. But if it's actually over time, becomes also really ingrained in how people want to live differently together, if we come back to that idea of a carbon neutral city, then it's much harder just to kind of, wipe away just because a new person comes in.
I think one of the exciting ideas of the book and your previous research, kind of going all the way back to the entrepreneurial state, is about how risk sharing also needs to be reward sharing. That, governments are often on the hook for when things go wrong and get a lot less of the upside when it does go right. And I just want you to talk to us a little bit more about that idea of how that can work in practice, and also what that can mean for the knowledge of people who work for the government. I think you make this important point that if we want governments to be risk-taking and ambitious, it has to be exciting to work there. A lot of people go first to the private sector. So how do you make it so that these big minds who you want in these mission-oriented organizations within the government are there, and that they aren't enticed to go work for consulting companies instead, where they can travel the world and do lots of different things?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first thing is exactly as you just framed it, which is if you have a choice of going into, place A, place B, and place A, you're allowed to take risks. You're actually seen as an investor. Your own creativity is allowed to flourish and you're allowed to make mistakes. We all know that we wouldn't know how to ride bicycles if we didn't fall off and then get back on and then, keep going, versus this other place where you're at best there to facilitate these other cool risk takers, right? You're going to de-risk them, enable them, facilitate it, level the playing field, fix markets. Of course, you'll prefer to go to that first one, right? It's just cooler, it's funkier. So this is why, by the way, I mean, I've been really interested in how the US government in some moments of its history has been able to attract talent, right? So Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, agreed under the Obama administration to run the DOE, not because the remit was come and help us, facilitate Elon Musk's wonderful, Tesla kinds of investments. It was, hey, we're going to have an 800 billion stimulus program. We want to use it to green direct kind of the stimulus. And do you want to come and help? And he's like, yeah, hell yeah. How exciting. Now forget what then happened. We all know things didn't go very well with the Tea Party and so on. But that idea that you're there to not just talk about the rate of growth, but the direction of growth, and that your role is to help steer things, kind of tilt the playing field, not by picking, one technology, one industry, but tilt it really in a new direction. That is exciting. But unfortunately, again, the actual culture in many public institutions then doesn't allow that. Your own career trajectory isn't actually measured by how much risk did you take and how willing you were to make mistakes and so on. So one of the problems also is if the narrative, this is what's interesting in the US. In the US government, they did take risks. This is the whole point in my book, The Entrepreneurial State. Everything that makes our iPhone smart and not stupid was funded by the public sector. Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. So even in countries that did that, and many countries don't have that kind of active strategic state investments, if the narrative continues to be that you in the end kind of facilitated these things and didn't actually take the risk, because don't forget that for each of those technologies I mentioned, including the internet, there was many failures. Just like a venture capitalist will tell you that for every success, they have to accept that there'll be failures. If we don't admit that with the state and pretend it's just fixing markets along the way, then the second part of the equation, which is you don't just fund stuff, you make sure that citizens are actually benefiting along the way. that doesn't happen. So in the US, I think what we've ended up with is a situation where we've socialized the risks. Government has made lots of active investments, including, by the way, things we might not necessarily agree with, things like fracking. Fracking, the whole shale gas revolution very much came out of public investments, and some people will argue that that's not necessarily a good thing. But regardless of that as well as the digital pharmaceutical innovation, 40 billion a year goes in from the National Institutes of Health. So the second part of the equation, let's just take that health example, would be, well, let's make sure that these medicines that come out of that publicly co-created process, obviously alongside the private sector, is governed in such a way to benefit citizens. And we haven't done that, right? So the intellectual property rights continue to be abused. They're too wide, too strong, hard to license, too upstream. The prices of the drugs are not reflecting that public sector investment. And then also, if you look at the portfolio of investments, for example, that the Department of Energy did under Steve Chu, who I mentioned before, on the one hand, yes, big, bold bets around companies as different as Solyndra, which then went down, and everyone knows about that, but the same amount of money went to Tesla. It was about 500 million for each. And if it's not talked about explicitly as a portfolio, government as a public venture capitalist, an investor first resort, then it ends up just picking up the mess when things go wrong, as it did with Solyndra. 500 million, everyone kind of talked about it as another example of government not knowing what it was doing. And then Tesla instead is described as this great, result of entrepreneurial spirit of people like Elon Musk. And what was so interesting in that example, what Obama said to Tesla was, well, to Elon, if you don't pay back the loan, which he got in 2009, we're going to get 3 million shares in your company. We meaning Obama, the US government. And so people, in theory, which makes no sense. Why would you want 3 million shares in a company that hasn't paid back its loan? It's probably not a very good company. It did pay back the loan in 2013. Had the agreement been, because we're a public venture capitalist, we'll get 3 million shares if things go well. That would be the VC mindset, not communism, capitalism. Then the price per share went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round. But that requires confidence in the negotiation, and it requires a different framing and explicit kind of storytelling of what you've done.
This brings up two important points. One that we talked about the last time we spoke, which is around narrative and storytelling and the language we use to talk about governments and changing that. But I want to say, how do you apply that to governments and groups of people who will hear this and just think, no, this is way too interventionist, right? Like, who just simply want the government to get smaller and like out of it, who see everything that's happened during the pandemic and it kind of like frightens them that it's doing too much. Kind of, what do you say to people about in terms of reaching long-term goals, that this can work? And that, is it all about making government bigger and more everywhere and more risk-taking?
So, I mean, the first point and why I did so much of the history stuff in the previous book is this is already what governments are already spending and investing a lot of money. But if it doesn't have the right framing, it also doesn't have the impact that it could have. This mission-oriented approach, if you really frame it like that, you get lots of different sectors, you get lots of spillovers. Again, like everything in our phones in some ways was a spillover of mission-oriented investments. So if you don't really reflect on how to do that, you're missing out on the kind of economy-wide, let's call it multiplier. But also, if you look at even just what the existing pots of money, like look at procurement, right? Government procurement, which is government as purchaser, not just investor. Those other examples I was giving was government on the investment side. On the demand side, buying, that's a huge pot of money. It's often 40% of government budgets. The redesign of procurement, the redesign of existing funds that are being used for the kind of sector specific instead of a mission-oriented approach to industrial strategy, grants and loans, redesigning them to be mission-oriented. It's not about bigger government, it's about smarter government, and government that actually understands its role with public purpose at the center instead of being a handout machine. I've looked a lot, for example, at public banks globally. Some public banks, like in the country where I'm from, Italy, are literally just handout machines helping existing sectors to kind of stay in place, and whoever yells the loudest gets some form of a bailout. Some other public banks, like the German one called the KfW, has been mission-oriented. So for example, the bailout they gave to the steel sector, this was 2 years before COVID hit, was conditional because there was a mission at the top of Germany's economy to have a green transition. It was conditional on the steel sector transforming itself. So they got the money to transform, not just because they needed help. And that was conditional on lowering their material content, which they did through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology throughout their whole value chain. And they today have the greenest, more sustainable steel production in the world. And so, bringing in, for example, conditionalities is another really important thing if government's going to get a good deal. And by government, again, I mean people, right? Government is there to serve the people. So conditionalities are another really interesting thing I think that we've learned about in COVID, because some countries have implemented them with the recovery funds. So even with the existing amount of money, without saying we need more recovery funds, with the existing amount, there's different ways to structure it. And if it's simply a handout, you're not going to build back better. If instead you can nest and design within the recovery fund conditionalities, and maybe we need a better word, because sometimes the word conditionality just sounds kind of negative, that you're forcing someone to do something. But in France, the condition for both Renault and Air France was they had to lower their carbon emissions, at least commit to that. In Denmark and Austria, sorry, just super quickly, the condition was you have to pay your tax. So if you're using, tax havens, you can't get access to the recovery funds.
Yeah, before I move on to some of the audience questions which are coming in now, just a reminder that it's at ccga.live. And you can vote on questions you like there too. I just want to ask a little bit about how these past missions, that especially some of the ones in the book, really seem to heavily rely on the military and defense department spending. And I kind of wanted to think about how do we do this kind of mission thinking and this approach and have it on a larger scale, right? So not just maybe an investment bank here or another department there, but thinking about it bigger without relying on that kind of military industrial complex to get there.
So a very important point, and that's why I do always begin with the SDGs, right? The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are there because every country actually, agreed to them 5 years ago. It's only 5 years ago or 6 years ago now, right? So those goals, if we transform them into missions, have to be tackled by definition across different departments of government. None of them are just about one department, like Department of Health or Department of Education, to actually I just have them in front of me here, quality education, gender equality, reducing inequality, decent work and economic growth, zero hunger, and so on. All of these, if we're going to be serious about them globally, will require a massive change in how we, again, design the policies, both nationally, but also locally within nations, and then internationally, coming back to your global point before. But that example also I gave of a fossil-free welfare state, that's not about defense. That's about changing everything government does, like public transport, public education, public health. And in each of those areas, there's lots of businesses obviously engaging with government to deliver, mobility systems and so on. So by having a really clear goal on what we're trying to achieve, that will then inform the type of partnership that we have with public and private. And instead of having a parasitic partnership, which is, I think, what we've had in the healthcare sector. And I'm not really blaming business, by the way. Government has allowed itself to be, kind of free-rided on. We need a symbiotic mutualistic partnership. And I think this mission-oriented approach across lots of different areas helps to achieve that. And on defense, what's super interesting, and I've only learned about this recently, health innovation isn't just funded in the US, for example, through the National Institutes of Health and through the kind of broader Department of Health. It's also been funded in the past through the Defense Department, because soldiers get sick on the war field. But what's interesting is the Department of Defense, because it sees its role as really important, got to win the war, got to help the soldiers, isn't naive. So if you look at, for example, the public-private partnership when the Defense Department interacts with business on medical and health-related areas on the war field, the deal is good, is a good one. The costs are contained in that way that I mentioned NASA did with the fixed price, contracts and incentives for innovation, the no excess profits clause that NASA had with the Apollo mission. The Defense Department still does that. So in some ways, only when we consider something really important do we kind of get real and get a good deal. And for these other societal and social missions, because we have wrongly not seen them with the equivalent amount of urgency, the departments in question have actually not, obviously it's more complex than what I'm saying, but still it's just, they have not actually fostered and forged and designed into the actual contract.
How do you apply this as well? The reason why I thought about the overuse kind of the military and defense departments is I was thinking about how do we end structural racism and improve gender equality? And these are issues that are just even more complicated in terms of, I think, for mission thinking than climate change even. And then, you can climate change, you can say, let's build 100 zero carbon cities or whatever, right? But I think back to all of this and I say, we have these other underlying challenges. How do we ensure that racism and gender equality aren't just kind of pushed aside in service of reaching these other missions? I just want you to just reflect on that a little.
It's an incredibly important question. And I think there's different, things that we need to consider. The first is, when we're talking about missions around racism, around inequality, around gender parity, the first thing is making sure that the right voices are at the table, and it's not just some sort of top-down mission that someone makes up and says this is going to help us kind of solve racism, and that's what we don't have in any of these missions, right? So even with like labor, labor unions have not actually been part of any of the climate change missions. And yet we talk about the just transition because labor comes in afterwards and says, oh, let's make sure that the transition towards a greener economy is just, so that workers are being invested in, but workers' voices weren't at the table ex ante to help even design that kind of co-creation phase I was talking about before. So in terms of racial justice, the first thing is we need to make sure that we definitely sincerely, in a non-tokenistic way, bring different voices to the table to even talk about what it means to tackle these problems in a mission-oriented way. So it's not just an academic exercise, but people who have not just suffered racism or gender inequality, but also have very important ideas of particular missions that we might have, that we have the avenues for different voices to be heard. And I sincerely don't think we have that. And that's why I talked about, both citizen assemblies, but also other areas. But the other thing is the lens, right? So, I mean, just a quick example, in the UK, we have a knife crime epidemic in London. There's also been knife crime epidemics across the UK at other moments. And what was interesting was in Glasgow, when they had this some years ago, they viewed it through a public health lens. So this kind of idea that there's social and economic determinants, right? Or, like when we look at racism, there's deep structural determinants underneath racism that we need to be solving. Otherwise, it just becomes, again, something that everyone can, huddle around in a cozy way and yet not solve the deep issues underneath. That public health lens to knife crime made the way that Glasgow went about that particular mission they had, which was to say zero knife crime amongst, it was especially amongst deprived young people in Glasgow. That helped them, that informed how they went about that problem. So with any problem, the lens you're bringing to the table matters. So coming back to this idea that it has to be cross-sectoral and cross-actor is really important. So it can't just be like, here's a certain amount of money, we're going to give some of it to social services, some of it to, a group that's going to look at, racism as a separate kind of area. Here's some for public education. Here's, actually focusing on what the actual mission is, which in that case was zero knife crime, and working backwards, and also thinking about the budget, an outcomes-based budget to tackle that problem, but also interacting with lots of different parts of the system to make sure that it really was kind of that intersectoral way. That really worked quite well in Glasgow. And here in London, for example, where it's mainly been looked at up until now, it's sort of changing through a crime lens as opposed to a public health lens, informed, I think, in a problematic way, how they've tackled it.
Let me ask you a question we got from the audience, which is, in terms of public incentives for private innovation that then have this public benefit, so this kind of risk reward sharing that we were talking about, are there any countries that are getting this right?
I think your point before, which is let's get it right systemically, not just have like little examples here and there, whether it's a public bank, I think is part of the problem. But in terms of certain mechanisms that they've gotten it right, I do think the answer is yes. So for example, in Israel, they had a public venture capital fund called Yozma. Without Yozma, there wouldn't be a startup nation, but Yozma did retain royalties and equity in the investments. Any country that has a public bank, by definition, retains kind of a return on equity investment within, on the companies that they are investing in. But I think the other thing is, when you have, for example, a wealth fund, a public wealth fund, say Norway does, it doesn't mean you're getting it right just because you have it. The problem is, how can you make sure you're also designing it so the wealth fund itself, which is, bringing back to the public sector, a share of the wealth that it's creating. In their case, it's mainly coming from the deep sea oil. North Sea oil is actually then reinvested in areas that are kind of good for people, right? So in that case, it's not working very well. Most of that investment goes actually back to real estate or finance, insurance, and real estate kinds of areas. And so I think what's interesting is to both look at countries that have gone beyond thinking of the public institution as a handout machine, but also then really thought through that kind of design challenge. What is the accountability and the governance of that public fund, public bank, public venture capital entity like YOSMA, in order to make sure that it's not just kind of like a one-time investment, but what is then reinvested back in is kind of, fostering new opportunities that are good in a kind of public interest, public good kind of way. And I think what's interesting in the US is that this has increasingly been talked about at the local level. So different cities and states in California, but also in New York City, there's also a fund that's being set up along kind of these lines. And it's very new for the US, because in the US, what they've been good is on the investment side. And then, as I mentioned before, haven't been very good at kind of then making sure we're governing the process to come back also in such a way that benefits the public return. But public return shouldn't just be seen in terms of money. It's also about conditions. So conditionality on reinvesting profits. And what's interesting in the US currently, there's a huge value extraction going on in terms of, say, share buybacks being used. So this is money not being reinvested back in, profits not being invested back into production, but being used just to buy back shares that boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. In the US history, not only did we have less of that, but also when government gave monopolies out, like for example, AT&T had a monopoly and earned monopoly profits, there was a condition that those profits had to be reinvested also into innovation and big innovation beyond telecoms. And that's where Bell Labs actually came from. Bell Labs, which is one of the best kind of, successes within the private sector of an innovation laboratory, came about because there was that strong conditionality with government. And that itself is a public return for public investment, because you get kind of greater spillovers in the economy. Or if you're making sure the prices of drugs that the public sector actually invested in reflect that, that also is a public return. So it's not just—
We're running out of time, Marianne. I hate to cut you off. We're basically at time, and I wanted to ask a final question really quickly, which was the role of organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO in doing this. They have really complicated histories that means that in many countries they don't seem to work, or that they've been too cautious, and their policies, we're seeing their policy change a lot now. And I think about some of these ideas in your book, and I wonder, how would this work with the WTO? Would they see all this stuff as kind of like state aid and uncompetitive and the rest of it? I mean, do you speak to these organizations? How can they play a part in this making mission approaches cross borders?
Again, I'll try to make it brief. I mean, with the state aid rules, I think what's very important is to remember that if you read some of these rules properly, and those writing the rules sometimes don't even read the rules properly, state aid is a problem if it's, again, just kind of, the state financing something that then keeps the kind of status quo, or is just helping existing incumbents remain in power. But for example, in Europe, the state aid rules allow direct strategic government investment, as long as you're really doing something new and shaping a new market and creating a new area that then can crowd in other sorts of actors. So in some ways, if you have a proper mission-oriented approach where government is clear and confident of what it needs to get done, then the different types of public monies that would go to help make that happen should be accepted, if you want, under state aid rules, as opposed to that kind of quick way that I talked about, a handout machine, right?
Yeah.
And yet the problem is, if you don't know what your role is, and if you do continue to think of yourself as a market fixer, the irony is you end up actually getting into a rut where you end up doing things which can, under state aid rules, be seen as anti-competitive. But the other thing is, I mean, the IMF and the World Bank in particular, in terms of the developing world, the kind of conditionalities they put are not the conditionalities I've been talking about. Those were conditions on austerity. Those were conditions actually reducing the public budget, which has over time decimated in many different countries their own, again, public administrations. The exact opposite of what I talked about earlier with Vietnam and Kerala, which have done quite well under COVID, precisely because they actually made those investments, which might have in the short term increased the deficit or debt, but in the long term been really good for their own competitiveness and long-term growth, which actually reduces debt to GDP because you're fostering that long-termism. So, they have been part of the problem. Luckily, they've woken up. But the problem is, even when the IMF and the World Bank write papers saying, oh, whoops, austerity was wrong, it's not enough just to say, oh, let's flood the system with public money. You need structures in place to make sure that it's actually, creating a dynamic ecosystem and again, fueling investment for the public interest. And that requires a framework that's very different from this market failure one. And that's where I think the mission-oriented economy can help create both an organizational framing, but also a policy design framing.
I'm gonna wrap us up. I could talk about this for ages. I want to tell everyone they should definitely go pick up this book and read it. I found it really inspiring and actually hopeful, because you do create a very clear framework for thinking about some of these bigger issues that when you open the book might seem impossible. I think, right now in this moment, we are in the UK where we're still in our lockdown, where we're also worrying about climate change, while we're also worrying about inequality, while we're also worrying about violence against women and all of these things. They can seem very overwhelming, but that the mission-oriented approach is a way to kind of think about these challenges in kind of practical terms and make real action happen. And it's been great to watch the policy work that you have done. I'm going to give you the last word to say, what do you say to the skeptics out there? What kind of your rallying cry here to get people on board with this idea of mission-oriented thinking?
I guess to abandon the ideology. I mean, it's just so boring and so old to go back to the usual thing. Oh, this is about picking winners. Oh, this is about the big state. I mean, if you really read between the lines throughout the book, but also if you look at what certain types of governments are doing when they're experimenting around this, it really is about building a more effective, more dynamic government, but also more, again, symbiotic partnerships. So open your eyes and, welcome the experimentation that we said that was so important. I think we really do need to get into the mode of what works, what doesn't, and to stop saying, is it state or market or business? But it's, markets are outcomes of how we govern governments, how we govern businesses, and especially how they relate one to another. And if we want inclusive and sustainable growth, we have to get that partnership to transform away from what it currently is. And it is hopeful, I think. I think you're right, it is. We have to have
need
hope
a little bit of that.
Father, yeah.
We need a little bit of that. On that note, I'm going to wrap up now, and thank you all for joining us, and definitely, pick up the book and engage with us on Twitter or else to keep talking about these ideas.
Thank you.